Everyone thinks Max Verstappen dominating Formula One is the safest thing this sport has right now. The fastest driver, the strongest team, total control. But what if that is exactly the problem? Because dominance in Formula One is supposed to stabilize the grid. It is supposed to create predictability. It is supposed to give the sport a center. And yet, right now, the more Verstappen wins, the more unstable everything around him starts to feel. So here's the real question. What happens when one driver becomes so dominant that the system itself can no longer contain what he represents? Because this is not just about winning races anymore. This is about pressure building underneath a system that was never designed for this level of imbalance. And if that pressure releases, it does not stay contained. It spreads from one team to the entire grid. But to understand why that even sounds possible, you have to start with what everyone believes is happening right now. Because on the surface, nothing looks broken. In fact, everything looks exactly like it should. Max Verstappen is winning. Red Bull is executing. The gap to the rest of the field, while not always massive, is still decisive where it matters most. If you look at the numbers, the pattern is familiar. Win rate consistency, qualifying dominance in key moments. Race pace control under pressure. We have seen eras like this before. Michael Schumacher with Ferrari, Lewis Hamilton with Mercedes. So naturally, the narrative writes itself. This is just another dominant era, another cycle in Formula One history, and most fans accept that. Because it is logical, the best driver finds the best team builds the best car, and together they create distance from everyone else. That is how Formula One works, but here's where it starts to feel different. Because unlike past eras, this dominance is happening inside a system that was specifically redesigned to prevent it. Cost cap regulations, aerodynamic testing restrictions, closer performance windows across teams. Everything about modern Formula One is built to compress the field, and yet Verstappen still finds a way to stretch it. So, what does that mean? Is he just that much better? Or is something else happening underneath that narrative? Because when a system is designed for balance, and one element still breaks that balance, it creates tension, not just competitive tension, structural tension, and that is where the stakes start to change. Because this is no longer about one driver being ahead, it is about what that dominance forces everyone else to do. Teams start making more aggressive decisions, drivers start looking at contracts differently, development paths become riskier because second place is no longer acceptable when first feels unreachable. And that is how instability begins quietly, slowly, then all at once. So if you're starting to feel like something about this era does not quite match what we have seen before, you're not imagining it. Because the real story is not about how strong Verstappen is. It is about what his dominance is starting to do to everything around him. And that is where things begin to shift. If you see this differently, this is the moment to lock in your perspective. Because what comes next is where the cracks start to show. And once you see them, you cannot unsee them. Because once you start looking for those cracks, they're not hard to find. Take the way Verstappen has been talking over the radio. Not frustration from losing, not panic under pressure. Something else, shorter answers, less emotion, more control. That might sound like nothing, but in Formula One, tone matters because drivers do not just react to performance, they react to trust, and trust usually breaks before results do. So, what does that mean? Why would a driver who is still winning start sounding like something is off? Now, look at the car itself. Red Bull is still fast, but not in the same untouchable way. There have been weekends where the margin disappears, moments in qualifying where the gap closes faster than expected, races where strategy becomes survival instead of control. And here's the key detail: it is not consistent. Because dominance is not just about being fast, it is about being predictably fast. When that predictability starts to fade, even slightly, it changes everything, but it gets worse. Because internally, the direction of the team is no longer as clear as it used to be. Small decisions, setup compromises, technical adjustments that do not fully align with Verstappen's driving style. Individually, these are normal. Every team deals with them, but stacked together, they create something else: misalignment. And misalignment inside a dominant team is dangerous because it does not show immediately. It builds quietly under the surface. So now you have three things happening at the same time: a driver whose tone is changing, a car that is losing its predictability, a team that is no longer perfectly aligned. That is not collapse, but it is not stability either. So the question becomes, is this just a temporary phase, or is this the early stage of something bigger? Because when you connect all of this, it stops looking like isolated issues. It starts looking like a system under pressure, And this is where the story changes. Because it is easy to say Verstappen is still dominating, it is harder to ask what that dominance is actually doing to the system around him. Here is where everything flips. This is not about Verstappen being too strong. It is about Formula One no longer being built to handle someone like him. Because modern Formula One is engineered for convergence, tighter budgets, closer performance windows, reduced advantage cycles. The goal is simple: keep the field close, keep multiple teams competitive, keep the outcome uncertain. But Verstappen breaks that logic, not because he is just fast, but because he is consistent in a way the system cannot neutralize. And when one element resists convergence, the system has to react, either by adapting or by pushing back. So, what does that look like? It looks like regulations tightening in key areas. It looks like teams taking bigger risks to close the gap. It looks like internal pressure rising inside even the strongest organizations, because no system stays passive when one variable becomes too dominant. And this is the part nobody is saying out loud. The problem's not that Verstappen is winning. The problem is what his winning is forcing everyone else to do. And once that starts, it does not stop at one team, it spreads. So now the real question is not whether Verstappen keeps winning. The real question is what happens when the system finally reacts to him. If you think this is just another dominant era, say it, because this is where the line gets drawn. Because once the system starts reacting, it does not react gently. So, what does a system reacting actually look like? It does not announce itself, it shows up in patterns. Look at how Formula One has been tightening the rules over the past few seasons. The cost cap was introduced to limit runaway spending. Aerodynamic testing restrictions were designed to slow down the fastest teams. Development windows were narrowed to compress performance. On paper, that should have reduced dominance. But here's the contradiction. Despite all of that, Verstappen still wins at a rate that breaks the model. In 2023, he won 19 out of 22 races. That is not just dominance. That is statistical separation from the rest of the field. And when one variable refuses to normalize, the system adjusts around it. So, what does that adjustment look like in real terms? Teams start shifting philosophy. Instead of building long term stability, they chase short term breakthroughs. Instead of incremental gains, they take aggressive design risks. You saw glimpses of this with Mercedes trying radical side pod concepts, Ferrari oscillating between setups across race weekends, even midfield teams gambling on upgrades that either work instantly or fail completely. Why? Because second place is no longer a competitive position. It is a holding pattern, and that changes behavior. But the reaction is not just technical, it is political. Because Formula One has always been a balance of power, teams, FIA, commercial interests. When one team and one driver stretch that balance too far, pressure builds behind the scenes. Regulation discussions become more targeted, interpretations become stricter, gray areas disappear faster, not because the system is unfair, but because the system is trying to restore equilibrium. And this is where the logic becomes unavoidable. If Verstappen stays exactly where he is, the pressure keeps building. If he moves, everything shifts instantly. Driver market, team hierarchy, competitive balance. One move creates a cascade. That is the chain reaction. Because in a compressed system, there is no space to absorb a shock. So even the idea of Verstappen leaving Red Bull or losing alignment with the team is not a small story. It is a structural event, and here is the deeper implication. This is no longer about whether Verstappen is the best driver on the grid. It is about whether the current version of Formula One can coexist with a driver operating at that level of consistency and control. Because if it cannot, something has to give. Either the system adapts again or the structure around him changes. And that brings us back to the question from the beginning. What happens when one driver becomes too big for the system? The uncomfortable answer is this: the system does not break instantly. It bends, then it reacts, and eventually it resets. The only unknown is where that reset happens. Does it happen through regulation, through team changes, or through a moment no one is expecting yet? Because once a chain reaction starts, you do not control where it ends. So now the real decision is not about Verstappen, it is about how Formula One responds to him. And if you had to choose right now, or is this the moment where the sport quietly starts pushing back?